They dragged a single mom and an autistic man into court, relying on injustice and expensive lies to crush them. But the developer made a fatal error. He underestimated a mind that sees the world differently. He thought his trap was inescapable, until one specific detail, invisible to everyone else, turned the entire case upside down. Watch how the ultimate vindication came from the voice no one expected to hear. The envelope waited on the worn brown doormat like something that had a pulse. Sarah noticed it the second she pushed open the chipped blue door of her small apartment on the edge of Cleveland, and for a moment she just stood there, one hand on the knob, feeling the air change around her. It was thick, cream-colored, with her full name printed in dark, serious letters, the kind of letters that never brought good news. Her fingers tingled before she even bent to pick it up, as if her body already knew this was the kind of paper that could rewrite a life. She almost stepped over it, almost pretended she had not seen it at all. Inside, the apartment smelled like tomato sauce and laundry detergent, the two scents that made this place feel more like home than the peeling walls ever could. A pot still sat warm on the stove from the early dinner she had cooked before her second shift, and the small living room was crowded with second-hand furniture and the soft chaos of toys her little boy had left under the table. This was their safe corner of the world, small but hard one, a place where the outside noise of unpaid bills and long shifts softened once the door closed. As she walked in, the envelope stayed in her hand, like a stone she forgot to drop. It did not belong to this fragile piece, and that alone made it dangerous. Through the thin wall to her right, she could already hear the steady, familiar rhythm of wooden pieces clinking together. Daniel, her neighbor across the hall, was probably working on his puzzles again, lining colors and shapes into perfect rows the way he did every night at almost the same time. He was in his early 30s, on the spectrum, gentle and literal and steady. And somehow he had slipped into her life the way a song slips under a closed door. Years ago, when his mother got sick, Sarah had promised to check on him. Just until things settle. Things never settled, but the promise stayed. Now, when she thought of her small family, her mind always counted 3 people, not 2. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter, while she shrugged off her faded denim jacket. But even from across the room it felt like it was watching her. There was no return address, only a window of clear plastic showing a second, smaller print inside, and a red stamp at the top that made her stomach dip. She knew those stamps. They lived in the same world as overdue notices and past due rent, words that never said please or thank you, only you must and final warning. Still, this one looked different. Heavier somehow, as if whoever sent it expected her to read it with her hands shaking. Her throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the long day at the diner. Once, years back, a letter had arrived just like this, carrying words about irreconcilable differences and signatures that ended a marriage she still did not fully understand. In her mind, paper had become a thing that took instead of gave. A voice inside whispered that if she did not open it, if she just tucked it in a drawer, the words inside would stay asleep. But another voice, the quieter, stubborn one that kept her moving through double shifts and lonely nights, said that danger did not disappear just because she refused to look at it. She left the envelope on the counter like a dare and crossed the hall to Daniel's door, knocking softly the way he preferred. He answered after a moment, his shoulders hunched in the oversized grey hoodie he always wore, fingers still curled around a blue puzzle piece. His eyes flicked to her face first, searching for clues, then drifted down to the envelope she had not realized she was still carrying. The overhead light in his small place buzzed faintly, and on the table behind him, neat rows of wooden blocks stood like tiny buildings in a city only he understood. Something about his calm pulled her back from the edge, just enough to breathe. Daniel tilted his head, studying the thick paper as if it were another puzzle. 3 stamps, he murmured, more to himself than to her, his gaze narrowing. Important. Or they want you to think it is important. He always noticed numbers, patterns, little things other people's eyes slid right past. Sometimes his words sounded like riddles, but over the years, Sarah had learned to listen to them, because they often held a strange kind of truth. Tonight, though, his comment only made the envelope feel heavier in her hand, as if it had grown while she was not looking. 3 is bad, he added quietly, though he could not explain why. Back in her kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant TV from another apartment formed a soft, familiar noise, but inside her chest, everything felt sharp and loud. She turned the envelope over and over, tracing the edges with her thumb, noticing how the glue at the flap was perfectly sealed, no hint of what waited inside.
Her brain tried to guess. Another bill, a landlord notice, something about the building changing owners. Each guess carried a different kind of fear, and each one opened its own small door to a future where things got even harder than they already were. She did not yet know that the true answer was worse than any of them. With a breath that tasted like metal, she slid a finger under the flap and tore it open, the sound too loud in the tiny kitchen.
For a second, she remembered her son asleep in the small bedroom down the hall, and Daniel just across the corridor. 2 people who had learned to trust her steadiness, her way of making even small catastrophes feel survivable. The thought made her hands shake as she unfolded the papers, the black ink inside suddenly more frightening than any raised voice or slammed door she had ever known. The words came into focus slowly, as if they knew the power they held and wanted to enjoy the moment. Notice to appear. The phrase sat at the top of the page, formal and cold, pulling all the warmth out of the room at once. It was not a bill. It was not a warning. It was a summons, the kind people received when someone somewhere had decided that their life needed to be judged. Sarah felt the bottom drop out of her stomach as she read the next lines, each sentence heavier than the one before. Words like allegations, safety concerns, and failure to provide a suitable environment leaped at her, refusing to be softened or misunderstood. Her fingers tightened until the paper crinkled. Her thoughts scattered, then snapped back to one line near the middle of the page, a line that seemed to glow darker than the rest. Regarding the matter of Sarah Collins and the individual known as Daniel Reed. For a moment she thought she had misread it, that exhaustion had tricked her eyes, but the names stayed where they were, side by side like 2 defendants in the same invisible cage. This was not just about late rent or some technical rule she had broken. Someone, somewhere, had decided that the way she lived, the way she cared for Daniel, was a problem big enough to drag into a courtroom. The realization scratched at her chest like claws. A buzzing started in her ears, louder than the refrigerator, louder than the hallway TV, the kind of sound that came when panic crowded out everything else. She saw flashes of what this might mean even before she finished reading. Questions from strangers in suits, papers pushed across desks, voices picking apart every tired choice she had ever made. She remembered the building manager's too wide smile last week, the way his eyes lingered on Daniel when they passed in the hall, the fake sympathy in his voice when he asked if everything was under control. At the time, it felt like nosiness. Now it tasted like something else entirely. Forcing herself to keep reading, she found more phrases that made her skin go cold. Potential risk to other residents. Unpredictable behavior witnessed. Failure to take appropriate action. They were talking about Daniel as if he were a hazard sign, as if his quiet routines and literal answers were some kind of hidden weapon. They were talking about her as if caring for him made her reckless, dangerous, a bad mother by association. In a few dry printed paragraphs, someone had turned their small, peaceful arrangement into a threat and labeled her love as negligence. Her mind jumped with cruel speed to her son, to the way he sometimes held Daniel's hand in the hallway, asking him about his puzzles, trusting him with the pure ease only children still carried. If a judge read these words and believed them, what else might be questioned? Her job, her apartment, her right to raise her own child in this cramped, slightly messy, fiercely loved home. She imagined strangers deciding whether she was fit, weighing her entire life on a scale they would never let her see. The thought wrapped around her throat like a hand. The letters on the page blurred for a moment, then sharpened again when she blinked away the sting. At the bottom, in the same calm, distant tone, the paper listed a date, a time, a place she had never been but already feared, a courthouse downtown, where polished floors and high ceilings made people feel smaller on purpose. She traced the date with a shaky fingertip, counting the days in her head, realizing how little time she had to prepare for something she did not understand. The words never once mentioned kindness or context, or the nights she had spent calming Daniel after a bad dream. Only rules and violations and consequences. A soft knock at her open door pulled her back into the room. Daniel stood there, half inside, half in the hall, his eyes fixed not on her face this time, but on the paper in her hands. People often assumed he did not notice things, that his quiet meant ignorance, but Sarah knew better. He noticed almost everything, just in his own way, at his own pace. "You are making your scared face," he said calmly, his voice as flat as always, but his fingers twisting the hem of his sleeve betrayed him. "Is it about me?" he asked, and the way he said me made the word sound heavier than any sentence on the page. Sarah swallowed, her first instinct to fold the document in half and hide it behind her back, as if paper could lose its power once out of sight. But Daniel stepped closer, his gaze following every movement, and something in her chest cracked at the idea of lying to him, of confirming with her actions the very picture those strangers had painted. For a heartbeat, she considered telling him it was nothing, that everything was fine, that grown-up problems did not concern him. The lie hovered on her tongue, sweet and easy, the way lies often were at the start. Then her eyes fell once more on his name, printed there in bold, unforgiving ink. The apartment seemed to shrink around them as she searched for words that did not exist, words that could make this softer without turning it into a story it was not. She forced the corners of her mouth upward into something that might pass for a smile in bad lighting, hoping he would accept it, hoping her voice would not shake when she finally spoke. "It is about all of us," she managed, each syllable thick. Daniel frowned slightly, as if turning that answer over and checking its edges, already sensing the missing pieces. Before she could say anything else, her eyes slipped back to the signature at the bottom of the letter, a name she did not recognize but would soon learn to hate. She did not yet know what kind of person sat behind that expensive-looking name, or how far they were willing to go to push her and Daniel out of the only place that still felt like theirs. She did not know what stories they were already telling about her in offices downtown, or how carefully they had planned this quiet attack. Standing there with the paper trembling in her hands and Daniel watching her with that careful, searching gaze, Sarah felt the ground under her shift, slow and steady, like ice beginning to crack. If you had opened that envelope and seen your life turned into accusations on a page, would you fight back or shut down? And what would you be most afraid of losing first? Tell me in the comments below, because the choice Sarah makes next will pull her into a world she never imagined facing. The name at the bottom of the page was Arthur Vance, written in a sharp, slanted signature that looked more like a blade than a signature. Sarah had never seen the man, but she knew the type. He was the kind of developer who saw neighborhoods not as collections of homes and memories, but as lines on a map to be erased and redrawn for profit. Over the last few months, vague rumors had floated through the hallways, talk of renovations, of new management, of letters offering small sums for people to leave quietly. But Arthur Vance didn't seem interested in offers anymore. He was interested in leverage, and he had found his in Daniel. From her kitchen window the next morning, Sarah watched a sleek black sedan glide down their street, looking as out of place among the rusted pickup trucks and faded sedans as a shark in a goldfish bowl. The windows were tinted dark, hiding whoever sat inside, but the car slowed as it passed their building, lingering just long enough for someone to take a look. It felt deliberate. It felt like a predator circling, checking the strength of the fences before deciding where to breach. Sarah pulled the curtain back just an inch, her heart hammering against her ribs. a primal instinct warning her that the enemy was no longer just a name on a piece of paper. Later that day, she saw him, not from a distance, but up close, in a way that made her skin crawl. She was walking to the bus stop for her shift, head down against the wind, when she noticed a man standing near the entrance of their building, talking to the superintendent. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than her entire year's rent, his shoes polished to a mirror shine that reflected the gray sidewalk. He wasn't shouting or making a scene. He was smiling, a tight, thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. As she passed, his gaze slid over her like oil, cold and assessing. He didn't know her face yet, but he knew her apartment number. He knew her vulnerability. "It's a matter of liability," she heard him say as she walked by, his voice smooth and cultivated. "We can't have unpredictable elements near families. It lowers the value." The words floated in the air behind her, toxic and precise. He wasn't talking about structural damage or plumbing. He was talking about a human being. He was talking about Daniel. The realization made her stop mid-step, her hands balling into fists inside her jacket pockets. This wasn't just greed. It was a calculated campaign to paint a quiet, harmless man as a monster, so a rich man could build condos. That evening, the atmosphere in the building shifted. Neighbors who usually offered a wave or a smile now looked away when she passed, their eyes darting nervously toward her door. The poison Arthur Vance had been dripping into the superintendent's ear was already spreading. Sarah found a flyer taped near the mailboxes. Community safety meeting, discussing recent incidents. There had been no incidents. Daniel had lived there for 10 years without so much as a noise complaint. But fear is a powerful architect. It can build walls where there were none, overnight. Vance was constructing a narrative where Daniel was the villain, and Sarah was his negligent keeper. When she got back to her apartment, she found Daniel sitting in the hallway outside his door, his knees pulled up to his chest. He was rocking slightly, a rhythmic motion that usually meant he was trying to process too much input. "The lights in the hall are buzzing differently," he said without looking up, his voice tight. Sarah listened. To her, it was just the old fluorescent hum, but to him, it was a scream. She realized then that Vance didn't need to invent incidents. He just needed to apply pressure until Daniel cracked. If they could provoke a meltdown in public, they would have their proof. "It's okay, Daniel," she whispered, crouching down beside him, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. "We'll go inside. It's quiet inside." But even as she said it, she knew the walls were no longer enough. The threat wasn't just outside anymore. It was seeping through the cracks, turning their sanctuary into a trap. Daniel looked at her, his eyes wide and unblinking. "The man in the suit," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He smells like copper, like old pennies." It was a strange detail, specific and odd, the kind only Daniel would notice. Sarah shivered. Copper was the smell of blood. The next few days were a blur of tension. Sarah tried to find a lawyer, calling numbers from faded billboards and internet searches on her phone during breaks at the diner. The conversations were short and discouraging. Retainer, hourly rate, conflict of interest, words that acted as gatekeepers to justice. When she mentioned it was an eviction case involving disability rights, the pauses on the other end grew longer. "It's complicated," one lawyer told her, his voice weary. "These developers have teams. They don't just sue. They bury you in paperwork until you suffocate." She hung up feeling smaller than before. Then came the incident. It was small, orchestrated, and devastating. Sarah was at work, and Daniel was walking to the corner store, a route he had taken 1,000 times. According to the neighbor who told her later, a car had pulled up close to the curb, a black sedan. Someone inside had honked, long and loud, right as Daniel passed. Startled, overwhelmed by the sudden noise, Daniel had stumbled, knocking over a display of fruit outside the store. He had panicked, trying to fix it, his movements jerky and frantic. The car drove away, but the damage was done. People stared. Phones came out. The narrative was being written in real time. Violent man destroys property. Sarah arrived home to find Daniel pacing his living room, muttering sequences of numbers under his breath, his hands flapping at his sides. "I fixed the oranges," he repeated over and over. "I put them back. 42 oranges. I put them back." He was terrified, his safe world fractured by a noise he couldn't control. Sarah held him until he quieted, her heart breaking for the 1,000th time. She knew then that this wasn't just about an apartment. It was psychological warfare. They were trying to break him to get to her. That night, she sat at her small kitchen table, the legal notice spread out in front of her like a battle map. She had no money, no lawyer, and no power. All she had was the truth, and in a world built by men like Arthur Vance, truth was a currency with very little value. She looked at the date on the paper. 3 days. She had 3 days to figure out how to stop a tank with nothing but her bare hands. The despair was a heavy blanket, threatening to smother her, but beneath it, a spark of anger began to burn. They had made a mistake, she thought fiercely. They had assumed she was weak because she was poor. As she stared at the paper, Daniel knocked softly on the open door. He held out a small wooden block, a perfect cube. "The foundation has to be strong," he said simply, placing it on the notice, right over Arthur Vance's signature. "If the bottom is wrong, the tower falls." Sarah looked at the block, then at Daniel. He wasn't talking about buildings. He was talking about logic, about structure. And suddenly, she realized that even the most carefully constructed lies had weak points. Arthur Vance had built a trap, yes, but every trap had a mechanism, and every mechanism could be jammed if you knew where to look. "Wait until he sees the lights in the courtroom," the landlord had reportedly said to someone, a snippet of gossip that had found its way back to Sarah. It was a threat. They were counting on the environment of the court, the lights, the noise, the pressure, to trigger Daniel. They wanted a show. Sarah felt a cold resolve settle in her gut. If they wanted a show, she would give them one, but not the one they expected. She looked at Daniel, who was now calmly rearranging her salt and pepper shakers. "Daniel," she said softly, "do you remember the game we play about noticing things?" He looked up, nodding slowly. "The detective game. I am good at it." Sarah smiled, a grim, determined expression. "Yes, you are, and we're going to play the biggest game of our lives." She didn't know if it would work. She didn't know if she could protect him from the sharks circling in the water. But as she looked at the wrong foundation Daniel had pointed out, she felt the first stirrings of a plan. They thought they were hunting a helpless woman and a broken man. They didn't realize they were walking into a room with someone who saw the world in a way they could never understand. The phone rang, jarring her from her thoughts. It was the court clerk, confirming the hearing time. "Just a reminder," the voice said, bureaucratic and bored. "Failure to appear will result in a default judgment." Sarah gripped the phone tight. "We'll be there," she said, her voice steady for the first time in days. She hung up and looked out the window at the city lights, knowing that somewhere out there, Arthur Vance was probably sleeping soundly, confident in his victory. He didn't know that the trap he had set was about to catch something he never saw coming. The world is vast when you have money, a sprawling map of open doors and handshakes. But when you are poor, the world shrinks. It becomes a series of small, locked rooms. The waiting room at the clinic, the manager's office at work, the bus shelter in the rain. For Sarah, in the days leading up to the trial, the world became the size of her kitchen table, covered in scribbled notes and legal printouts she could barely understand. She felt the crushing weight of a system designed to be navigated by those who could pay for a guide. She was alone in a labyrinth, and the Minotaur was wearing a suit. She tried the legal aid clinic first. The room smelled of wet wool and desperation, filled with people clutching folders like lifelines. She waited 3 hours to speak to a paralegal who looked younger than her, with tired eyes and a stack of files teetering on her desk. "I'm sorry," the woman said, not unkindly, but with the flat affect of someone who says no 50 times a day. "We're at capacity. Unless there's immediate physical danger, we can't take new eviction cases until next month." Next month. By next month, she and Daniel would be on the street. "It's not just eviction," Sarah pleaded, leaning forward, her voice cracking. "They're targeting him. They're using his disability to force us out." The paralegal sighed, rubbing her temples. "I believe you. I really do. But without proof of discrimination. It's your word against a property development firm. Do you have a retainer for a private attorney?" The question hung in the air, absurd and cruel. A retainer. Sarah had $40 in her checking account and a jar of quarters for laundry. She walked out into the grey afternoon, the city noise sounding like a roar of indifference. She went to 3 other firms. At the first, the receptionist didn't even let her pass the glass partition. At the second, a junior associate listened for 5 minutes before checking his watch and handing her a pamphlet on tenant rights that she had already read online. At the third, an older lawyer actually sat down with her. For a flickering moment, hope sparked. Then he asked for $5,000 up front. "To start the discovery process," he explained, as if asking for $5,000 was as casual as asking for a cup of coffee. "Justice isn't free, Ms. Collins. It's a service." That night, the isolation hit her harder than the rejection. She sat on the edge of her son's bed, watching him sleep, his breath steady and untroubled. He didn't know that his mother was terrified. He didn't know that the roof over his head was being pulled away by invisible strings. Across the hall, she could hear Daniel humming a low, monotonous tune. It was his way of self-soothing. He knew something was wrong. He felt the static in the air, but he couldn't grasp the shape of the threat. That was the hardest part, protecting them from a monster they couldn't see, while she stared it right in the face. She felt a deep, aching loneliness, the kind that settles in your bones. It wasn't just about not having a partner or a parent to call. It was the realization that in the eyes of the city, she and Daniel didn't matter. They were obstacles to progress. Whatever shiny glass tower Arthur Vance wanted to build, it was worth more than their lives. She thought of calling her ex-husband, but the shame stopped her before she even picked up the phone. He would ask why she was living next to that guy. He would say she brought this on herself. She couldn't bear the "I told you so" when she was already drowning. The next morning, 2 days before the hearing, Sarah was in the library, using the public computer to look up "How to Represent Yourself in Court." The screen was blurry through her tired eyes. A man sat down 2 terminals away. He wasn't looking at a screen. He was looking at her. She felt the prickle on her neck and turned. He was older, wearing a coat that had seen better decades, his face lined like a roadmap of hard years. He slid a piece of paper across the table toward her. On it was a single name and a phone number. "He helped my brother," the man whispered, his voice rough like gravel. "Doesn't charge much. Hates bullies." She called the number from the lobby. It rang 6 times. A voice answered, gravelly and impatient. "Yeah?" She stumbled through her story, the words tumbling out in a rush. The eviction, Daniel, the trap, the lies. The line was silent for a long time. Then the voice said, "Vance? Arthur Vance?" The tone changed. It wasn't friendly, but it was interested. "Meet me at the diner on 4th in an hour. Don't bring money. Bring the papers." His name was Elias. He wasn't a lawyer anymore. He was disbarred, a fact he told her within the first minute of sitting down, dipping a fry into a pool of ketchup. "Drank too much, fought too hard, pissed off the wrong judge," he said with a shrug. "But I know the law better than those shiny suits Vance hires." He read through her papers with a speed that was terrifying, his eyes scanning the lies, the fabricated complaints. He didn't offer comfort. He offered strategy. "They're going to bait him," Elias said, pointing a fry at her. "They don't have a case for eviction on the rent. You pay on time. So they need cause. They need danger. They're going to poke the boy until he screams, and then they'll say, 'See? Dangerous.' Sarah felt cold. How do I stop them? Elias looked at her, his eyes sad and sharp. You can't stop them from trying. The judge will let them ask questions, but you can prepare him. And you, he leaned in, you need to stop acting like a victim. You're not a victim. You're a witness. You see what they don't. He wouldn't be able to stand with her in court. He had no license. But for the next 48 hours, he coached her. He taught her when to object, how to frame an answer, how to look the judge in the eye. It was a crash course in survival. The night before the trial, the air in the apartment felt electric. Sarah was ironing her only blouse, a white button-down that had yellowed slightly at the collar. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, arranging his silverware. Fork, knife, spoon. Fork, knife, spoon. Daniel, she said softly. He stopped. Tomorrow is going to be loud. There will be people. Bad people. Daniel didn't look up. Like the man with the copper smell. Sarah nodded. Yes, he will be there. And he will try to make you confused. He might ask you questions fast. He might make noises. Daniel went back to the silverware. I don't like loud, he stated, a fact as immutable as gravity. I know, Sarah said, fighting back tears. But remember the game, the detective game. If it gets loud, if it gets scary, you look for the clues. You look for the broken pieces. You don't have to listen to the noise, you just look for the puzzle. It was a desperate strategy, a Hail Mary pass. She was asking a man who panicked at the sound of a honking horn to walk into a pit of vipers and stay calm. Daniel finished his row of silverware. He looked up, his expression unreadable. Then he said the sentence that would haunt her until the moment they walked into the courtroom. The bad man wears the wrong shoes. Ah, Sarah paused, the iron hissing in her hand. What do you mean, Daniel? He tapped the table. In the picture, the one they put under my door, the bad man wears the wrong shoes. Sarah hadn't seen a picture under his door. A chill went down her spine. Had they been threatening him directly? She rushed to check, but there was nothing there now. She dismissed it as his way of processing the stress, a metaphor she couldn't pass. Okay, Daniel, she soothed. Just try to sleep. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the apartment felt heavy, pressed down by the looming morning. She felt small. She felt unprepared. But she also felt a strange, cold clarity. She had no allies in that courtroom, no expensive legal team. Just a disbarred drunk's advice, a mother's desperation, and a neighbor who noticed the world in fragments. It wasn't enough. It shouldn't be enough. But as the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, Sarah realized she wasn't just fighting for an apartment. She was fighting for the right to exist in a world that wanted to erase them. The alarm went off. It sounded like a gunshot. Sarah rose, dressed in her slightly yellowed shirt, and went to wake Daniel. He was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed, fully dressed in his best clothes, a mismatched suit jacket he'd found at a thrift store, and pants that were a little too short. He looked ridiculous and dignified all at once. He looked like a target. Sarah took his hand. Ready? She asked. Daniel didn't answer. He just stood up, clutching a small, worn fidget spinner in his pocket. They walked out the door, into the hallway, and down the stairs, stepping out of their sanctuary and into the arena. The courthouse stood on a street lined with buildings that all looked the same. Gray stone, thick columns, steps worn smooth by decades of feet climbing toward judgment. Sarah felt the weight of it before they even reached the door, a pressure in her chest that made breathing feel like work. Daniel walked beside her, his hand gripping hers so tightly her fingers went numb, but she didn't pull away. The city noise around them seemed muffled, as if the building itself swallowed sound. When they pushed through the heavy wooden doors, the smell hit her first. Old paper, floor polish, and something metallic she couldn't name. It was the smell of institutions, of places where people became case numbers. The entrance hall stretched high above them, all marble and echoes. Every footstep rang out like a bell, announcing arrivals and departures. People in suits moved with purpose, briefcases swinging, heels clicking in rhythm. Sarah felt conspicuous in her faded blouse and Daniel in his thrift store jacket. They looked like what they were, people who didn't belong in rooms where power was traded like currency. A security guard waved them through a metal detector, bored and mechanical. Daniel hesitated at the beeping machine, his shoulders hunching. Sarah squeezed his hand. "It's okay. Just walk through." He did, stiff and jerky, drawing a few glances from the waiting lawyers. They found the courtroom number on a directory board, 3rd floor, room 308. The elevator was broken, a handwritten sign taped to the doors. Sarah looked at the stairs and felt her exhaustion double. They climbed in silence, Daniel counting each step under his breath. 1, 2, 3. His voice was barely a whisper, a lifeline of routine in unfamiliar territory. By the time they reached the 3rd floor, Sarah's legs trembled and Daniel's breathing had quickened. The hallway stretched before them, doors identical and imposing, numbers etched in brass. Room 308 waited at the end like the mouth of a cave. Outside the door, a few people milled about. A woman in a sharp navy suit checking her phone, a man with graying temples reviewing documents on a clipboard. Sarah recognized the man immediately. Arthur Vance. He looked even colder in person, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed in that way only the truly confident can manage. He glanced up as they approached, and his eyes passed over them with the interest one might give to furniture. No recognition, no guilt. Just a brief visual sweep before he returned to his papers. Sarah felt invisible and exposed all at once. Inside the courtroom, the ceiling seemed impossibly high, designed to make people feel small. Rows of wooden benches stretched toward the front, where a judge's bench sat elevated like a throne. The wood was dark and polished, reflecting the cold overhead lights. Those lights buzzed, a faint electrical hum that most people wouldn't notice. But Sarah saw Daniel's eyes track upward, saw his jaw tighten. The sound was drilling into him already, and they hadn't even sat down. She guided him to a bench near the back, hoping distance from the lights would help. It didn't. The buzzing seemed to follow. The courtroom filled slowly. A bailiff entered, clipboard in hand, calling names and checking attendance. A stenographer set up her machine with practiced efficiency. Then came Vance's lawyer, a man who looked like he had been assembled in a factory that produced intimidation. Tall, silver-haired, expensive suit, so crisp it could cut. He carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Sarah's car. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a message. You are outmatched. Sarah opened the folder Elias had helped her prepare. Printouts, notes, highlighted passages of tenant law. It looked pathetic next to the lawyer's briefcase. She felt a wave of nausea, the kind that came from knowing you were about to be humiliated in public. Daniel sat beside her, his hands pressed flat on his thighs, fingers splayed wide. He was trying to ground himself, to manage the sensory overload. The buzzing lights, the rustling papers, the whispered conversations, it was all pressing in on him. Sarah whispered, "Just breathe. We're okay." The bailiff stood. "All rise." The room rose as one, a choreographed obedience Sarah hadn't been prepared for. She scrambled to her feet, pulling Daniel up with her. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled back, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked tired, the kind of tired that came from hearing too many sad stories. She sat. "Be seated." Everyone sat. The judge shuffled papers, glanced at her docket, and sighed. Sarah's heart sank. They were just another case in an endless line, another file to close before lunch. Case number 4782, Vance Properties versus Collins and Reed. The lawyer stood, smooth as oil. "Your Honor, we're here to address a matter of tenant violation and safety concerns." His voice was pleasant, reasonable, the voice of someone explaining why rain is wet. He made it sound so simple, so obvious. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her. The judge nodded, barely looking up. Proceed. The lawyer smiled, and Sarah recognized the expression. It was the smile of a predator who had already tasted blood. He began by painting a picture, not with facts, but with implications. He talked about vulnerable residents, about unpredictable individuals, about failure to maintain a safe environment. He never said Daniel's name, but every word pointed to him like an arrow. Sarah watched the judge's face, looking for a flicker of skepticism, but found only the blank professionalism of someone listening to a script. The lawyer's voice was hypnotic, calm, building a case out of air and suggestion. Sarah realized with horror that he was good at this, dangerously good. Daniel's legs started bouncing, a rapid up and down that shook the bench. Sarah put a hand on his knee, trying to still him, but his body was responding to a frequency she couldn't control. The lights buzzed louder. The lawyer's voice droned on. Someone coughed. The combination was a sensory assault, and Daniel was losing the battle. His hands began to flap slightly at his sides, a self-soothing gesture that Sarah knew well. But to everyone else in the room, it looked like agitation. It looked like proof. The lawyer paused, letting the silence stretch. Then he turned, just slightly, and gestured toward where Sarah and Daniel sat. Your Honor, we have documented incidents of disruptive behavior. We have witness statements. He pulled papers from his briefcase with theatrical precision. We believe this situation poses a risk to other tenants. The word risk hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt Daniel stiffen beside her. He understood that word. He understood that it meant him. His breathing quickened, shallow and rapid. The judge looked up for the first time, her gaze moving past the lawyer to the back of the room. Her eyes landed on Daniel, taking in the flapping hands, the bouncing leg, the wide-eyed panic. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw something. Pity, maybe, or recognition. But it passed. The judge's face returned to neutral. Ms. Collins, you'll have your opportunity to respond. The words were meant to be fair, but they sounded like a formality. The verdict, Sarah realized with sinking certainty, had already been written in the judge's mind before they even walked in. The trap was closing, and Daniel's fear was the bait that would spring it. The lawyer stood tall, his presence filling the center of the courtroom. He walked with the relaxed grace of a man who owned the space, his shoes clicking softly on the floor. Sarah clutched her folder, her knuckles white. She had practiced what to say, but her throat felt dry as desert sand. Ms. Collins, the lawyer began, his voice dropping an octave, becoming intimate and sorrowful. We understand your dedication. It's admirable, really. He turned to face the gallery, then pivoted back to her, a master of theater. But dedication can blind us, can't it? He wasn't asking her. He was telling the judge. You see your neighbor as a friend, a project. But my client sees the reality. Broken windows, terrified children, noise at all hours. He listed the accusations like items on a grocery receipt. Mundane, believable, damning. Sarah tried to stand, to object, but her legs felt like lead. Is it true, he asked, his tone suddenly sharp, that you leave Mr. Reed unsupervised for hours at a time? The question was a trap. If she said yes, it was negligence. If she said no, she was a liar, because she had to work. Sarah stammered. He doesn't need supervision. He's an adult. The lawyer smiled, a thin, pitying expression. An adult who plays with blocks? An adult who panics at a car horn? He produced a photograph. It showed the fruit stand incident, zoomed in on Daniel's frantic face, his hands blurred in motion. Out of context, it looked violent. It looked like rage. This is not the face of a calm man, Your Honor. This is instability. He passed the photo to the judge, who took it without expression. Sarah wanted to scream that he was just trying to fix the oranges, that he was scared, not angry. But the image spoke louder than her silence. "And you," the lawyer continued, turning his gaze fully on Sarah now. "A single mother, working 2 jobs, exhausted." He made her struggle sound like a crime. "How can you possibly manage a volatile situation like this? Aren't you, in fact, endangering your own child by bringing Mr. Reed into your home?" The accusation hit her like a physical blow. He wasn't just attacking her tenancy, he was attacking her motherhood. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and stinging. "Daniel is family," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's gentle." The lawyer shook his head slowly. "Family doesn't smash storefronts, Ms. Collins. Family doesn't drive down property values." He gestured around the room. "We all want to be kind, but kindness has limits. When kindness becomes a liability, we have a duty to act." The judge scribbled something on her notepad. The sound of the pen scratching paper was agonizingly loud in the quiet room. Sarah looked at Daniel. He was rocking faster now, his eyes squeezed shut. He was blocking out the words, retreating into his safe place. But to the room, his withdrawal looked like guilt. It looked like someone who couldn't handle reality. "I have neighbors willing to testify," the lawyer said, holding up a stack of affidavits. "People who are afraid to leave their apartments. Lies. All of it." Neighbors she had shared coffee with. Neighbors whose packages she had taken in. Had they really signed those papers? Or had Vance bought their signatures with promises of renovated units and lower rent? Betrayal tasted bitter in her mouth. "We aren't asking for punishment," the lawyer concluded, his voice soft again, reasonable. "We are asking for safety, for order. An eviction is unfortunate, yes, but necessary to protect the community." He sat down, adjusting his cuffs. He looked immaculate. Untouchable. He had turned Sarah's life into a problem to be solved, a mess to be swept away. Sarah stood up. Her legs shook. "Your Honor," she began, her voice small. "Those things aren't true." It was weak. It sounded like a child's protest. The judge looked over her glasses. "Ms. Collins, do you have evidence to refute the incident report?" Sarah fumbled with her folder. She had character references. She had Daniel's medical records. But she didn't have a photo of the truth. "Mr. Reed," the lawyer interrupted from his seat, not even bothering to stand. "Perhaps we should ask him." He pointed a pen at Daniel. "Let's see this gentle nature for ourselves." It was the moment Elias had warned her about. They were pivoting. They were done with her. Now they were coming for him. Sarah moved to block his view of Daniel, instinct taking over. "Leave him alone," she said, louder this time. The judge frowned. "Ms. Collins, sit down. Counsel has a right to cross-examine." The order was sharp. Sarah froze. She looked at the judge, pleading with her eyes. "Don't let them do this." But the judge's face was stone. The lawyer stood up again, smiling that shark-like smile. He walked around the table, moving into the open space between the benches and the witness stand. He wasn't going to the podium. He was going to Daniel. He was invading the safe zone. Sarah felt a surge of panic so strong it made her dizzy. He was walking toward the fuse he intended to light. Daniel opened his eyes. He saw the man coming. He saw the shiny suit. He smelled the cologne, heavy and chemical. His rocking stopped abruptly. He sat frozen, like a deer hearing a twig snap. The lawyer stopped 3 feet away, looming over him. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice booming in the quiet room, "tell the court what happens when you get angry." The lawyer didn't wait for an answer. He took a step closer, invading the invisible bubble of personal space Daniel needed to survive. "Do you hear voices, Mr. Reed?" he asked, his voice sharp, clipped. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed as inquiry. Daniel shrank back against the hard wood of the bench, his eyes darting from the lawyer's shiny tie to the bright lights above. "The lights are buzzing," Daniel whispered, his hands gripping his knees so hard his knuckles turned white. The lawyer seized on it. "Buzzing?" Like in your head? He turned to the judge, eyebrows raised. He hears buzzing, Your Honor. Disconnected from reality. He was twisting Daniel's sensory pain into madness. Sarah started to rise, but the bailiff took a step forward, a silent warning to stay seated. Then the tapping started. The lawyer began to tap his pen against his legal pad. Click-clack, click-clack. It was rhythmic, persistent, annoying to anyone, but to Daniel, it was torture. His hearing amplified everything. The sound hit him like physical blows. He flinched with every tap, his breathing becoming a ragged gasp. The lawyer saw it and tapped harder, faster. Can you look at me when I speak to you? The lawyer demanded, leaning in. He knew eye contact was difficult for Daniel. He knew forcing it caused distress. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. No looking. Too bright, he mumbled. The lawyer smirked. Refusal to engage, evasive. Is he hiding something, or is he simply incapable of following basic instructions? The lawyer moved around Daniel, circling him like a predator. He changed the volume of his voice, whispering 1 second, shouting the next. Did you break the display? Yes or no? The sudden shout echoed in the high ceiling. Daniel let out a small whimper, covering his ears with his hands. Too loud, he cried out. Red noise! Red noise! Red noise? The lawyer laughed, a cold, dry sound. Violent imagery. He associates noise with the color of blood. He was rewriting Daniel's language of distress into a language of threat. The judge looked concerned now, leaning forward. She didn't see a man in pain. She saw a man losing control. The trap was working perfectly. Sarah felt tears of rage hot on her cheeks. Stop it! She yelled, ignoring the bailiff. You're hurting him! The lawyer ignored her. He leaned right into Daniel's face, close enough to whisper, You're a burden, aren't you? Sarah is tired of you. Everyone is tired of you. It was the cruelest lie, designed to shatter Daniel's heart along with his mind. Daniel began to rock violently, his whole body swaying. A low moan started in his throat, a sound of pure anguish. The lawyer stepped back, spreading his arms wide as if presenting an exhibit. Your Honor, look at this. Imagine this in a hallway with children. Imagine this near your family. He pointed a finger at the rocking man. Unstable, dangerous, a ticking bomb. The courtroom was silent, except for Daniel's moans. The air felt heavy, suffocating. The lawyer had gotten exactly what he wanted. A spectacle. He walked back to his table, looking satisfied, adjusting his tie. He didn't even look at Daniel anymore. He had broken the toy. Now he was ready to discard it. Daniel's rocking slowed, but the moan turned into a sob. He looked small, broken, a child in a man's suit. He pulled his knees up to his chest, feet on the bench, curling into a ball. It was a violation of court decorum, but no one moved to stop him. It was too pitiful. The monster the lawyer had described was just a terrified soul trying to hide. The judge looked at Sarah, her expression severe. Ms. Collins, if you cannot control your friend, I will have to have him removed. The words were a death sentence for their case. If Daniel was removed for being disruptive, they lost. It proved everything Vance claimed. Sarah felt the hope drain out of her like water from a cracked jar. She looked at the lawyer who was whispering to Vance. They were smiling, a small, shared smile of victory. They had won. They had crushed a butterfly with a sledgehammer and called it justice. Sarah looked at Daniel, wanting to hug him, to take him home, to forget this nightmare. But then Daniel stopped crying. The sobbing cut off abruptly, like a switch had been flipped. He lifted his head from his knees. His face was wet with tears, blotchy and red, but his eyes were clear, laser-focused. He wasn't looking at the lawyer. He wasn't looking at Sarah. He was staring at the large projection screen where the lawyer had displayed the photos of the damage. The photos were still up, frozen in high definition. Daniel's gaze locked onto them with an intensity that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up. He wasn't rocking anymore. He was calculating. "The shadow," Daniel said. His voice was no longer a whimper. It was flat, loud, and absolute. The lawyer stopped smiling. The judge froze, her gavel halfway to the block. The room held its breath. Daniel pointed a shaking finger at the screen. "The shadow is wrong." The silence that followed Daniel's words was heavy, the kind that fills a room after a glass shatters. The lawyer turned slowly, an amused smirk playing on his lips, expecting more nonsense. "The shadow is wrong," he repeated, his tone dripping with condescension, playing to the gallery. "I'm afraid art criticism isn't relevant here, Mr. Reed. Please, let's not waste the court's time." But Daniel didn't retreat. He stood up. For the first time, he didn't look like a victim. He looked like a scientist observing a specimen. He walked out from behind the bench, ignoring the bailiff who started to move toward him. He walked straight to the large screen, his eyes never leaving the image. "Relevant," Daniel said, correcting the lawyer. "Time is relevant. Physics is relevant." He pointed to the corner of the photo where the shadow of a street lamp stretched across the broken window. "This photo," Daniel stated, his voice gaining strength, shedding the tremble of fear. "You said it was taken at 8 p.m. after the incident, to show the damage I made." He turned to the judge, his posture stiff but commanding in a strange, awkward way. "But the shadow is long, and it points west." The judge frowned, looking from Daniel to the photo. "What is your point, Mr. Reed?" she asked, her voice less sharp than before, curiosity battling with impatience. Daniel tapped the screen. "In June at 8 p.m. the sun is setting. Shadows point east, away from the sun. This shadow points west. This means the sun is in the east." He looked at the lawyer, his eyes piercing. "This photo was taken in the morning, at 6 a.m. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at the photo. He was right. The geometry was undeniable. 6 a.m., Daniel continued, relentless as a ticking clock. "The incident happened at 5 p.m. How can you have a photo of the damage 12 hours before it happened?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. The lawyer's smirk faltered. He shuffled his papers, looking for a distraction, his smooth demeanor cracking. "Objection," he stammered. "This is speculation. The witness is not an expert in solar positioning." But the damage was done. The logic was too pure, too clean to be dismissed. Daniel wasn't speculating. He was measuring. "And the reflection," Daniel said, not finished. He pointed to a pane of glass in the photo that was still intact. "Zoom in." The judge looked at the bailiff. "Zoom in," she ordered. The image expanded. In the dark reflection of the glass, a figure was visible holding the camera. A man in a suit. "That is him," Daniel said, pointing to Arthur Vance, who was now sitting very still in the back row. "But look at his feet." In the reflection, the man's shoes were visible. They weren't the polished dress shoes Vance wore now. They were heavy, muddy work boots, the kind used on construction sites. "Why is the landlord wearing demolition boots to take a picture?" Daniel asked. "And why is there a hammer in his belt loop?" The detail was tiny, almost invisible but enlarged on the screen. The handle of a tool was unmistakable against the man's hip. The room gasped. It wasn't a murmur this time. It was a collective intake of shock. Sarah stood up, her voice trembling with adrenaline. "He broke it himself," she said, the realization hitting her like a wave. "He went there in the morning, broke the window, took the picture, and then waited for Daniel to walk by later to blame him." It was a setup, a cold, calculated frame job. Vance's face had drained of color. He whispered something furious to his lawyer, who was now sweating visibly. The lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. A trick of the light. We cannot verify." The judge slammed her gavel down, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. "Sit down, counsel." "Mr. Reed," the judge said, her voice soft, respectful. "Are you certain about the time?" Daniel nodded once. "The sun does not lie. Shadows do not lie. Only people lie." It was a profound, simple truth that cut through every legal argument made that day. The autistic man they had mocked for his obsession with details had just used those details to dismantle their entire reality. The judge turned her gaze to Arthur Vance. It was a withering look, full of the anger of a system that realized it had been played. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice icy, "I suggest you don't leave the building. The bailiff will escort you to a holding room while we examine the metadata on these digital files." Vance slumped in his seat, the arrogance finally stripped away, leaving only a small, frightened man. Daniel turned back to Sarah. The laser focus faded, and he looked tired again, his shoulders slumping. He walked back to the bench and sat down, pulling his knees up. "The buzzing is better now," he whispered to her. Sarah grabbed his hand, squeezing it tight, tears streaming down her face. They weren't tears of fear anymore. They were tears of awe. The lawyer tried to pack his briefcase, his hands shaking. He wouldn't look at them. The gallery was buzzing with whispers, people pointing at the screen, at Daniel, at Vance. The narrative had flipped in seconds. The monster wasn't the man rocking on the bench. The monster was the man in the expensive suit who thought he could buy the truth. "Case dismissed with prejudice," the judge announced, her voice ringing out. "And I am referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation into fraud and perjury." She looked at Daniel one last time before standing up. "Thank you, Mr. Reed. The court owes you an apology." They walked out of the courtroom not as victims, but as victors. The heavy wooden doors didn't feel oppressive anymore. They felt like gates opening to a new world. Sarah looked at Daniel, really looked at him. She had spent years trying to protect him from the world. She realized now that the world needed to learn from him. His mind wasn't broken. It was just tuned to a frequency of truth that most people were too busy to hear. Outside, the air was crisp and clean. The city noise was just noise again, not a threat. Daniel stopped on the steps, looking up at the sky. He squinted at the sun. "It is 11:42, he said. Sarah smiled, a genuine bone-deep smile. "Yes, Daniel, it is." She took his arm. "Let's go home. I think we need to celebrate. Maybe with a puzzle." Daniel smiled back, a rare, shy thing. "A big one," he said. "A very big one." The walk home from the courthouse was usually a journey Sarah measured in anxieties, unpaid bills, looming shifts, the constant hum of uncertainty. But today, the pavement beneath her feet felt solid for the first time in years. The city, which had seemed like a labyrinth of threats just hours ago, now opened up around them with a kind of grudging respect. People rushed past them on the sidewalk, eyes glued to phones, unaware that the quiet man in the ill-fitting suit walking beside her had just dismantled a corporate titan with nothing but a glance at a shadow. Sarah looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw the subtle change in his posture. He was still walking with that distinctive, slightly rigid gait, his eyes scanning the ground for patterns, but the crushing weight of the courtroom was gone. He wasn't hunched against an invisible blow anymore. He had stood in the fire, and he hadn't burned. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the sidewalk like fingers. Daniel stopped abruptly, his head tilting as he studied one of the shadows. Sarah had learned not to rush him during these moments. He was processing, computing angles and light in that unique way his brain organized the chaos of the world. After a long pause, he nodded to himself. "The angle is correct now," he said quietly. 4:17 p.m. Sarah glanced at her phone. It was exactly 4:17. She smiled. The world had tried to break him by calling his differences a disability. They didn't understand that what made him different also made him extraordinary. They stopped at the corner store. the same one where the incident with the oranges had happened. The owner, Mr. Henderson, was outside sweeping the sidewalk. He looked up, his expression wary, remembering the broken display and the shouting. Sarah felt a protective surge, ready to defend Daniel again. But before she could speak, Daniel walked up to the fruit stands. He didn't cringe. He didn't hide. He reached out and adjusted a single orange that was slightly out of alignment on the pyramid. 42, he murmured, satisfying his need for order. Then he looked at Mr. Henderson. The car was loud. I am sorry about the mess. It was simple, direct, and utterly devoid of the shame the lawyer had tried to force on him. Mr. Henderson's face softened. He leaned the broom against the wall and approached them slowly. Listen, son, he said, his voice gruff, but kind. I heard what happened in court today. News travels fast around here. He gestured down the street where neighbors were beginning to emerge from buildings, evening routine starting. That man tried to run all of us out, not just you two. We're glad someone finally caught him. He extended a weathered hand to Daniel. Daniel looked at the hand, processing the social cue, then carefully shook it. 3 seconds, he said, counting the appropriate length of a handshake. Mr. Henderson laughed, a genuine sound. Exactly 3 seconds. Perfect. As they turned onto their street, the late afternoon sun bathed the old brick buildings in a warm, golden light. Usually, Sarah saw the cracks in the mortar, the peeling paint, the signs of decay that whispered poverty. Today, she saw the resilience of the place. It was still standing, just like them. Window boxes held tired flowers that refused to die. Laundry hung from fire escapes, bright colors against faded brick. Children's chalk drawings decorated the sidewalk, crooked houses and smiling suns. This was a community, not just a collection of apartments, and Arthur Vance had wanted to erase it for condos and coffee shops that would price out every soul who had built a life here. They passed the spot where Vance's black sedan had idled, watching them like a predator. The spot was empty now. A stray cat sat there instead, cleaning its paw in the last rays of sunlight. Sarah felt a profound sense of relief, a physical loosening of the knot that had been in her stomach for weeks. They weren't just keeping their apartment, they were keeping their dignity. They had asserted their right to exist in this space, flaws and all. The wealthy could build their towers elsewhere. This ground belonged to the people who had watered it with years of struggle and small joys. When they entered the building, the air inside felt different, lighter, as if the walls themselves knew the danger had passed. Mrs. Chen from the second floor opened her door as they passed, her ancient face creasing into a smile. She said something in Cantonese, rapid and warm, and pressed a paper bag into Sarah's hands. Inside were homemade dumplings, still warm. For the hero, Mrs. Chen said in halting English, pointing at Daniel. Daniel looked confused. I am not a hero. I just corrected an error. Mrs. Chen patted his arm. Same thing, young man. Same thing. They climbed the stairs to the third floor, the familiar creak of the wood sounding like a welcome home song. At her door, Sarah turned to Daniel. He was already reaching for his keys, his routine reasserting itself. Daniel, she said, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite contain. You saved us today. You know that, right? Daniel paused, key hovering near the lock. He didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders lift slightly. The shadow was wrong, he said simply, as if that was the only thing that mattered. To him, it wasn't about heroism. It was about correcting an error in the universe. But to Sarah, it was everything. It was proof that the truth could still win, even when dressed in a thrift store suit. That evening, the apartment felt like a castle. Sarah cooked dinner, spaghetti with the good sauce she saved for birthdays, and the smell filled the small rooms with comfort. Her son sat at the table, oblivious to how close he had come to losing his home, babbling about school and cartoons. Sarah watched him, feeling a fierce, overwhelming gratitude. She looked across the hall, where Daniel's door was open a crack. She could hear the soft click of puzzle pieces connecting. It was the sound of order being restored. The world was chaotic, cruel, and often unfair, but in this little corner of Cleveland, the pieces fit. They had found the pattern in the noise. They had turned vulnerability into strength. After dinner, Sarah's son ran across the hall to show Daniel a drawing he had made at school. It was a crayon sketch of 3 stick figures holding hands, labeled Mom, Me, and Daniel. Daniel studied it with the same intensity he gave to everything, his finger tracing the lines. "The proportions are not accurate," he observed, "but the emotional content is clear." He looked at the boy with something approaching a smile. "Thank you. I will keep this." He placed it carefully on his refrigerator, using a magnet to secure it at precise right angles. The boy beamed and ran back, satisfied. Later, after her son was asleep, Sarah went to the window. She looked out at the city lights, the same lights that had seemed so cold and indifferent the night before. Now, they just looked like lights. She thought about Arthur Vance, probably sitting in a holding cell or shouting at his lawyers, his expensive shoes useless on a concrete floor. He had underestimated them because he only saw what was missing: money, status, social grace. He hadn't seen what was there: loyalty, love, and a mind that saw the truth with terrifying clarity. It was a lesson the world often forgot. The people you overlook are often the ones watching you the closest. They see the details you think you've hidden. She walked over to Daniel's door and knocked softly. "Daniel." He looked up from his table, where a sprawling landscape of 1,000 pieces was taking shape. It looked like a sunset over mountains, the kind of peaceful scene that felt appropriate after a day of battle. "It's time to close the door," she said gently. "It's safe now." Daniel nodded. He stood up and walked to the door. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes clear and calm. "The bad man is gone," he stated. "Yes," Sarah whispered. "He's gone." Daniel's hand reached for the doorknob, then paused. "Sarah," he said, using her name, which he rarely did. "When the lawyer said people were tired of me—" He trailed off, the hurt still visible beneath his calm exterior. Sarah felt her heart crack. "That was a lie, Daniel, the worst kind of lie." She stepped closer. "You are not a burden. You are family. You are my family." Daniel processed this, his eyes searching her face for deception and finding none. "Family does not lie," he said, repeating one of the rules they had established years ago. "Family does not lie," Sarah confirmed. "And I am telling you the truth. We need you." Daniel closed the door, and the click of the latch was the most final, satisfying sound Sarah had ever heard. It was the sound of a chapter ending, and a life, a real, messy, beautiful life, continuing. She stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the building settle around her. Pipes creaked. A television murmured through thin walls. Somewhere, a baby cried and was soothed. These were the sounds of home, of people living their imperfect lives in imperfect spaces. Arthur Vance would never understand that these sounds were worth more than any luxury condo. This was community. This was survival. This was love in its most stubborn, resilient form. Sarah returned to her apartment and sat at the kitchen table. The legal papers were still there, but they looked different now. Harmless, defeated. She folded them carefully and placed them in a drawer. Evidence of a battle won. Tomorrow she would go back to work. Bills would still need paying. Her son would still need shoes. Daniel would still need his routines respected. Nothing fundamental had changed about the struggle of their daily lives, but everything had changed about how she saw that struggle. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. And they had proven, in a room full of people who wanted to erase them, that their lives mattered, that their truth mattered, that they, against all odds, mattered. In the days that followed, The story of what happened in courtroom 308 did not stay inside those four walls. It leaked out in fragments, traveling from the stenographer to a cousin, from a clerk to a neighbor, from Mrs. Chen to the woman who ran the laundromat. By the end of the week, people in their neighborhood were telling it like a modern folktale. "Did you hear about the man who beat a millionaire with a shadow?" they would whisper, half in awe, half in disbelief. Sarah heard snatches of the tale every time she stepped outside, each retelling a little different, each one circling closer to the truth, and yet somehow missing the part that mattered most to her. At the diner where she worked, regulars who barely remembered her name suddenly wanted details. A man at the counter snapped his fingers as she poured his coffee. "Hey, you're that girl, right? The one from the court thing?" he asked, eyes bright with curiosity. She forced a polite smile, nodding, feeling exposed under his gaze. He wanted drama, a neat story about good versus evil that he could repeat over dinner. He didn't want to hear about nights spent shaking with fear, or the way her hands still trembled when she thought about losing custody of her son. He wanted the highlight reel, not the scars. One afternoon, a local reporter came into the diner with a camera crew, the microphone already branded with a station logo. She introduced herself with a dazzling smile and slid into a booth like they were old friends. "We'd love to feature your story," the reporter said, voice smooth as honey. "A single mom, an autistic neighbor, standing up to corruption. It's powerful, Sarah. People need hope." The words were flattering on the surface, but underneath, Sarah heard something else. "We need content." She imagined Daniel's face on TV, his mannerisms pulled apart by strangers who didn't understand them. The idea made her stomach twist. That night, she sat at the small kitchen table, the reporter's card between her fingers. The temptation was real. A story on TV could protect them, she thought. It could make it harder for another Vance to come after them quietly. Public eyes could be a shield, but another part of her whispered that it could also be a spotlight that burned. Daniel did not like being watched. He did not like loud noises, crowds, or sudden questions. A TV interview would be all of those things at once. Was she willing to trade his comfort for a little bit of safety, or maybe just a little bit of validation? She decided to talk to him, because that was one of their rules. No decisions about him without him. Sitting at his table while he sorted puzzle pieces by color, she slid the card toward him. "A woman wants to talk to you," she said slowly, choosing each word with care. "On camera, so other people can hear what you did." Daniel picked up the card, turned it over, then set it down again in a perfectly straight line with the table's edge. "I already did the important part," he said. "I corrected the lie. Why do they need to see my face to believe it?" His question sank into her chest like a stone. Over the next few days, more signals of attention arrived. An email from a disability rights group landed in her inbox, calling Daniel an inspiring advocate and asking if he would speak at a community event. A law professor reached out, curious if they would be willing to participate in a study about self-represented tenants. Each message praised Daniel's courage, his insight, his unique perspective. None of them asked whether he wanted to be turned into a symbol. Sarah read them all late at night, the glow of her phone screen painting her with a cold light that made her feel like she was the one on display. Meanwhile, the investigation into Arthur Vance began to stir the waters downtown. Elias called her from a payphone, his voice low and oddly triumphant. "They pulled the metadata from the photos," he said. "Timestamps don't lie either. Your guy was right down to the minute." Another pause, then a softer tone. "You're going to hear things. Maybe see his name on the news. They'll call it a scandal. Just remember, they'll try to spin it like one bad apple. They won't admit the whole barrel is rotten." Sarah thanked him, but when she hung up, she couldn't shake the feeling that she and Daniel had just stepped into a game with more levels than they could see. The building itself seemed to react to the news in small human ways. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact before the hearing now knocked on her door with casseroles, leftover pizza, even a stack of grocery coupons. "I signed one of those complaint letters." one man from the first floor admitted, eyes downcast. They made it sound bad. I didn't know. Sarah accepted his apology and the lukewarm lasagna he carried, but part of her couldn't forget how quickly fear had turned people she trusted into silent accomplices. It was a new kind of hurt, quieter than Vance's schemes, but somehow closer to the bone. Through it all, Daniel clung to his routines like a ship to its anchor. Morning coffee at exactly 7:15, the same route to the corner store, now taken with Sarah or her son beside him more often than not. The same puzzles, though lately she noticed him lingering longer over images of skies and horizons, spaces that stretched forward. When people in the building tried to thank him, calling him a genius, a hero, that guy who caught the landlord, he would tilt his head confused. I just told the truth, he would reply, as if they were praising someone for remembering to breathe. One evening, as Sarah dried dishes and Daniel shuffled through his meticulously organized mail, he paused at a plain white envelope with no return address. The paper was smoother than the rough legal notice from weeks before. The name printed on the front was his, not hers. They spelled my name right, he said quietly, a small note of surprise in his voice. Sarah, heart suddenly alert, watched him open it with careful fingers. Inside was a short typed letter and a business card clipped to the top. The logo was sleek. The company name underneath was unfamiliar, but the words "Media Consulting" jumped off the page like a warning flare. The letter was polite, almost gentle. It praised his remarkable attention to detail and compelling story, and suggested that with the right guidance, his experience could inspire millions. They offered to help manage interviews, brand his image, even explore speaking opportunities. The subtext was clear even to Sarah, who had never set foot in a PR office. We can package you. We can turn what happened to you into something we can sell. She felt a chill crawl up her spine that had nothing to do with fear of eviction this time. This was a different kind of trap, one made not of threats, but of flattery. She looked at Daniel, trying to read his expression. His eyes moved from line to line, his lips silently repeating a few phrases. Turn your story into impact, he read aloud, almost tasting the words. Manage your narrative. He frowned. Why would someone else manage my words? They are already in my head. The confusion in his voice cut through the haze of marketing language. To him, the offer was nonsensical. To Sarah, it was something darker. Another attempt by people with power to decide what the truth should look like. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Sarah realized they were facing a new question, one she had never imagined she'd have to answer. Before, the danger had been simple: lose the home, lose the case, lose Daniel's stability. Now, the danger was more subtle, almost seductive. Gain attention, gain protection, gain a voice, and maybe lose the quiet, private version of Daniel she cherished. Was visibility a shield or another weapon? Was turning their pain into a story for public consumption an act of survival or a new kind of surrender? The next morning, the letter from the media company sat on the table between them like a new kind of legal notice, one with no clear right or wrong answer. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that in a small, worn apartment, a different kind of decision was taking shape. One that would not be decided by a judge, or a gavel, or a shadow on a screen, but by a single choice: to step into the light on their own terms, or to close the door gently and keep the truth where it had always lived, quietly, fiercely, between them. And as Sarah watched Daniel trace the edge of the business card with one finger, she knew that whatever they chose next would change more than just their address on a mailbox. The decision was made quietly, over breakfast. Daniel slid the media company's card across the table until it fell into the trash bin. I am not a story, he said, spreading jam on his toast with geometric precision. I am a neighbor. Sarah felt a weight lift from her chest that she hadn't realized was there. They didn't need cameras. They didn't need to be symbols. They just needed to be Sarah and Daniel, eating toast on a Thursday. That was victory enough. Life settled into a new rhythm, one that felt earned rather than borrowed. The fear that had lived under their skin for weeks began to fade, replaced by something warmer. Sarah noticed it in small things, her son laughing louder in the hallway, the way she didn't flinch when the mail arrived, the way neighbors stopped to chat instead of rushing past. The building felt like a community again, knit together by the shared secret of their triumph. Then, a few weeks later, a different kind of letter arrived. This one was from the City Housing Authority. Sarah's heart jumped when she saw the official seal, old reflexes dying hard. But inside was a notice of new ownership. The building had been sold, not to another developer, but to a non-profit housing trust. The letter explained that due to the recent legal exposure regarding the previous owner, the property had been transferred to ensure stability for current residents. Rent was frozen for 5 years. Sarah read the letter 3 times. Then she read it to Daniel. He listened carefully, nodding at the numbers. 5 years is 60 months, he calculated. That is a long time. He looked at her, his eyes clear. We can finish a lot of puzzles in 60 months. It was the most beautiful sentence she had ever heard. It meant stability. It meant a future they could actually plan for, not just survive day to day. That evening, as the sun set painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, Sarah and Daniel sat on the front steps of their building. It was a simple act, one they might have been too afraid to do a month ago. People walked by, tired workers, laughing teenagers, parents pushing strollers. They were part of the flow of the city now, not obstacles to be removed from it. You know, Sarah said softly, watching a bus rumble past. They called you disabled, but you were the only one who was able to see what was real. Daniel considered this, watching a pigeon peck at a crumb on the sidewalk. People look at the big picture, he said after a moment, but the big picture is made of small pieces. If you lose the pieces, you lose the picture. He was right. The world was obsessed with grand narratives, with power and noise. But the truth lived in the details, in the shadow of a street lamp, in the reflection of a window, in the quiet loyalty of a friend. Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand. I'm glad you look at the pieces, Daniel. He squeezed back, a quick, firm pressure. I'm glad you look at me, he replied. A profound peace settled over them. They weren't rich. They weren't famous. They were just 2 people sitting on a stoop in Cleveland, watching the world go by. But they owned their space in it. They had faced a giant and won, not with strength, but with clarity. And in a world full of noise and lies, that quiet clarity felt like the most powerful thing of all. As night fell, the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the pavement. Daniel pointed to one. That shadow points east, he noted, checking his watch. The earth is still turning correctly. Sarah laughed, a sound that bubbled up from deep inside her. Yes, Daniel, the earth is turning correctly. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. The story ends here, but the echo of their victory remains. It reminds us that sometimes the ones we underestimate are the ones who save us. It reminds us that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. And it reminds us that the strongest foundations aren't made of concrete and steel, but of attention, kindness, and the courage to see things exactly as they are. It's easy to look away when we see someone like Sarah or Daniel fighting a battle that feels impossible. But if their victory touched you, if you felt the weight of the injustice and the relief of the truth, don't just leave it here. There are so many others fighting silent battles who need to know they aren't alone. Subscribe and like the video to help us share more stories that give a voice to the unheard. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real strength? I'd love to hear your story.